No one could have imagined that a night like that would end in ruins. Margaret Grayson, at 62 years old, walked through the ballroom of the Willowbrook Country Club as if she still had the obligation to appear intact. She smiled at the guests, exchanged greetings with judges, businessmen, old family friends. Beside her, Harold, sober, cool, impeccable. They were celebrating 40 years of marriage in front of more than 200 people. Everything seemed perfect. The luxurious decorations, the exaggerated toasts, the posed smiles. But inside, Margaret was no longer the woman she once was. She had woken up with a lump in her throat that no expensive coffee would go down, and she spent the day with the uncomfortable feeling that something was about to fall apart. It was a marriage built on silence and convenience, and her body knew it before her mind admitted it. At 6 o'clock, she put on the blue dress that Harold had chosen months before. The zipper in the back seemed to hold more than fabric. It held years of swallowed screams, of humiliations hidden in formal dinners and soulless trips. The bun, held together with stiff bobby pins, left no room for any stray strands, or for the memories that tried to escape. When she arrived at the ballroom, everyone surrounded her with compliments, hugs, and rehearsed speeches about an exemplary marriage. No one saw her trembling hands, her too-fixed gaze, the absence inside her. Margaret walked between the tables as if she were walking through the rubble of a house that had not yet collapsed. Margaret didn't know why, but something in her refused to follow the script that day. During dinner, she would look at the faces around the head table, but her mind would wander. Her son, Daniel, sitting to Harold's left, seemed restless, as if he too were disconnected from the performance. Eleanor, Margaret's younger sister, avoided all eye contact. There was a tension in the air, something that not even the expensive wine and forced laughter could dissolve. When the master of ceremonies announced that the couple would give the traditional acceptance speech, Margaret felt her heart race in a strange way. It was as if her body knew that there would be more to that microphone than just festive words. Harold was the first to speak. With his posture erect and intonation calculated, he began by thanking the guests, his family, and his wife. But then, without any change in tone, he uttered the sentence that cut through the room, like a blade. "I never loved you. You were just convenient." There was a pause that seemed to last minutes. The cutlery stopped. The conversations ceased. No one immediately understood whether it was a misplaced joke or a script error. But Harold did not laugh. He simply handed the microphone back with that same blank look that Margaret knew so well. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply took a deep breath, took the microphone firmly, and looked at Eleanor. At that moment, something inside her that had been trapped for 40 years finally broke. The room remained silent as Margaret began to speak. Her voice did not tremble, but there was a weight to each word that silenced any reaction. She did not read anything. She did not prepare a speech. She simply looked at the faces watching her and said, with the frankness of someone who no longer had anything to lose, 40 years ago, I got married while pregnant. But the father of my child was not Harold. His name was James Carter, and he was killed in a car accident 2 weeks before the wedding. Some of the guests widened their eyes, others lowered their gazes. Eleanor, with her hands folded in her lap, kept her eyes fixed on the floor. The celebratory mood evaporated. This was no longer a party. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Margaret then told what no one there had ever imagined. She said that she and James had planned to run away, that he was the great love of her life. But her father, a strict and proud man, found out everything and forced her to marry Harold. The pregnancy could not be leaked. The family's reputation came before anything else. Everyone thought that James had died in a tragic accident, but Margaret knew, even without proof, that it had not been a simple coincidence. That night, for the first time, she let the truth come out clearly. James had been murdered, and not by a stranger. She looked straight at Harold and said, with a coldness that few had seen in her before, "You killed the only man I have ever loved." And you made it seem like it was just fate." A murmur began to spread among the guests, but no one dared to interrupt. Margaret remained firm, as if each sentence released a piece of everything she had been forced to swallow for decades. She revealed that Eleanor, her sister, had witnessed the accident. She was only 19 at the time, but she had seen with her own eyes Harold's car heading towards James on a deserted street behind the factory. "You didn't brake. You accelerated. And then you got out of the car as if you were helping someone." Margaret's voice echoed like a sentence. Eleanor raised her head, pale, and simply nodded. The silence of all those years had been built on blackmail, fear, and guilt. But now, in front of everyone, it was beginning to crumble. Daniel, Margaret's son, was motionless. His face no longer held doubt, only astonishment. Margaret turned to him, carefully, as if that moment were also a liberation for him. She said that she had never had the courage to tell him the truth, that she had tried to protect him from a cruel reality, but that there came a point when silence became complicity. "You are not the son of a murderer, Daniel. You are the son of a man who would have truly loved you if he had had the chance to live." The revelation fell like lightning in the room. Some people cried, others just watched, not knowing how to react. Margaret did not expect forgiveness from anyone. She just wanted, for the first time, to let the truth breathe. Harold, unshaken until then, stepped forward and tried to interrupt, but it was too late. Margaret, with the calm of someone who had waited 4 decades for that moment, opened the bag she was carrying and took out a thick, carefully sealed envelope. She said that inside was the evidence that everyone had always said she would not have. It has photos. It has a letter written by James. It has records of financial transactions from the time. And, most importantly, it has a ledger that you thought no one would ever see again. She held up the envelope in front of the audience. 2 plainclothes police officers who were among the guests, on the instructions of Daniel, who had suspected his father's intentions for months, approached without saying a word. When she handed the envelope to the officers, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret looked at Harold again. There was no fear in her eyes. She simply said, "What you did will no longer be part of a family secret. It will be part of a criminal proceeding." Harold tried to protest, but the officers were already leading him out while the guests walked away, stunned. No amount of resistance from him was enough. The scene seemed unbelievable. The man who for decades had been seen as an example of seriousness, being handcuffed on his own wedding anniversary. Margaret did not cry. She just watched, as if watching the end of an invisible prison finally come undone. Harold's departure from the hall did not bring immediate relief. The atmosphere was still charged, as if everyone there had been hit by an emotional shockwave. Some guests left discreetly. Others remained as if trapped in a kind of trance. Daniel remained still, unsure whether he was crying or breathing. Margaret approached him with an almost maternal care, touching his shoulder as if to apologize for everything that had come before. She said nothing. It was not time for consolation. It was time for reconstruction. For the first time, mother and son looked at each other in a new way, without masks, without imposed roles, without Harold's suffocating presence between them. Eleanor, who had lived all those years by Margaret's side, also approached. She was visibly shaken, but she seemed relieved, as if carrying that secret had sickened parts of her that were now beginning to breathe again. She hugged her sister tightly, without words. The gesture said everything that had been bottled up for decades: fear, guilt, love, helplessness. That night, 3 people left the ballroom differently. None of them younger, but all of them freer. Margaret did not feel avenged. Revenge was never the goal. She wanted justice. And more than that, she wanted her silence to no longer be an inheritance for her son. She wanted Daniel to be able to look at his own past and know that, finally, the truth had space to exist. Margaret walked to the main table and picked up a small wooden box that was among the arrangements. It was discreet, old, and many had not even noticed its presence there. She opened it slowly, revealing a carefully folded letter that had turned yellow with age. It was James's last letter, written the night before his death. Margaret had kept that letter for 40 years, read it so many times that she knew every line by heart, but she decided to share it with everyone for the first time. She read it out loud, her voice firm, without embellishments. James spoke of fear. He spoke of love. He spoke of the suspicion that someone was after him, and he asked her to move on if anything happened. Don't let them erase what we've been through. One day, when you can, tell the truth. For me, for you, for this child you're carrying. As she read, the room fell into a different silence, no longer one of shock, but of respect. That letter was the last voice of a man who had been silenced by greed. It was the final piece of a puzzle that many people chose to ignore out of convenience, comfort, or cowardice. Margaret finished reading with steady hands, but with tears in her eyes. There was no theater here. There was real pain, real memories, losses that could not be recovered. The letter, simple and direct, humanized a name that until then had been just a shadow of the past. That night, James stopped being just a memory. He became, in front of everyone, the truth that sustained the entire lie of that marriage. When Margaret finished reading, she didn't expect applause or consolation. She just wanted that story to finally come out of her chest and reach the world as an indisputable truth. She looked at Daniel, who was still holding the envelope with the documents, and saw in him an expression she had never seen before, that of a man who, even in the midst of pain, was beginning to understand who he really was, not as Harold's son, but as the result of a story that had been forcibly interrupted and kept hidden for the sake of self-interest. Daniel walked to the center of the room, held the microphone that was still there, and spoke a few words, but they carried all the weight of that night. This party wasn't a celebration. It was a farewell, and I choose to leave here with the truth by my side. What followed was a slow dispersion of the guests. There was no mood to continue, not even to question. Many left with their heads down, others with tears in their eyes. Some in absolute silence. The Grayson family, for decades held up as an example of sobriety and success, was now seen in a different light, not because of the scandal, but because of their courage. Margaret did not stay until the end. She asked Eleanor to accompany her to the door, and Daniel followed. They crossed the hall in silence, each step marking the end of an era. No words were spoken between them on that journey, but the looks they exchanged said it all. The shared pain, the liberation achieved, and the certainty that, even if the future was uncertain, at least now it was real. Outside, the wind that night felt different. Margaret took a deep breath, as if for the first time the air wasn't filled with tension. She turned to look at the club's imposing building, lit by spotlights and adorned with flowers that now no longer made any sense. Inside was the last version of the woman who for years had lived to maintain appearances. For the first time in 4 decades, she no longer felt like she needed to represent anything. It was just her, with her wrinkles, her fatigue, and the truth finally told. Eleanor held her hand tightly, as if she were also saying goodbye to a heavy chapter, to years of forced omission. They both knew there was no going back, and in a way, that was also a relief. Daniel suggested that they go home together, and neither of them hesitated. In the car, no one said much. There was an emotional exhaustion so thick that not even silence could completely alleviate it. But there was also peace, a strange, new peace that she still didn't know how to accommodate. Margaret watched her son in the rearview mirror, trying to find traces of James that she might have ignored before. She thought about everything Daniel had failed to know over all those years, and at the same time she wondered if he would have been able to bear knowing sooner. At that moment, she understood that the truth has its own time, and that, even when it arrives late, it still has the power to rebuild broken bonds. When she got home, Margaret went straight to her bedroom. She took her time taking off her shoes, undid her bun, which had been held together with dozens of bobby pins, and looked at herself in the mirror for a few seconds. The face before her was the same as always, but something had changed in its eyes. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel ashamed of her own history. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out an old metal box from the bottom of her drawer, where she kept old newspaper clippings, faded photos, and small objects that had belonged to James. A button from his shirt, a broken chain, a letter he had written before their first trip together. She ran her fingers over each item as if she were touching a living person. It wasn't a ritual of grief, but of closure. In the living room, Daniel and Eleanor were talking quietly. His sister, visibly exhausted, said she never wanted to keep a secret like that again. Daniel, for his part, was trying to organize his thoughts. The image he had of his own father was shattered, but at the same time, he was beginning to see his mother in a different light. For years, he had seen her as submissive, passive, and resigned. Now he saw strength where before he thought there was only silence. He understood that her silence was not cowardice, it was survival. He felt betrayed, yes, but also proud that she had chosen that moment to change everything. On that sofa, among the pillows and scattered memories, a new story began to be written between them. The next morning, the news was already in the main local newspapers. Businessman arrested during wedding celebration after wife's shocking revelations. Social media was filled with comments, theories, speculation. Margaret didn't turn on the television, nor did she want to read anything. She knew that the headlines only captured the spectacle, not the pain, nor the courage, much less the years of silence that preceded the breakup. As she drank coffee, she looked out the window and saw the sunlight, hitting the plants in the garden that she tended herself. For the first time, that garden felt truly hers. It was no longer part of a display case. It was a space that she had created and could now occupy entirely. Late that afternoon, Margaret decided to visit the old factory warehouse where James worked. The place had been abandoned for years, but it still bore traces of its past. She walked slowly between the peeling walls and dirty floor until she reached the archives room, where she had found the ledger that James had hidden years ago. She ran her hand over the rusty table and sat for a few minutes. She closed her eyes and, for a moment, imagined what her life would have been like if everything had gone differently. She did not cry. There was no sadness in that exercise anymore. It was just the contemplation of a possibility that never existed. She got up silently, walked out the front door, and did not look back. That was where the past was. At home, it was all starting over, again. The next morning, the news was already in the main local newspapers. Businessman arrested during wedding celebration after wife's shocking revelations. Social media was filled with comments, theories, speculation. Margaret didn't turn on the television, nor did she want to read anything. She knew that the headlines only captured the spectacle, not the pain nor the courage, much less the years of silence that preceded the breakup. As she drank coffee, she looked out the window and saw the sunlight hitting the plants in the garden that she tended herself. For the first time, that garden felt truly hers. It was no longer part of a display case. It was a space that she had created and could now occupy entirely. Late that afternoon, Margaret decided to visit the old factory warehouse where James worked. The place had been abandoned for years, but it still bore traces of its past. She walked slowly between the peeling walls and dirty floor until she reached the archives room, where she had found the ledger that James had hidden years ago. She ran her hand over the rusty table and sat for a few minutes. She closed her eyes and, for a moment, imagined what her life would have been like if everything had gone differently. She did not cry. There was no sadness in that exercise anymore. It was just the contemplation of a possibility that never existed. She got up silently, walked out the front door, and did not look back. That was where the past was. At home, it was all